Okay, so welcome to this webinar hosted by the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. GPS is a top-ranked professional school devoted to the study of international affairs, economics, and public policy. We offer PhD, master's, and bachelor programs, one of which with a China focus is Master of Chinese Economic and Political Affairs. If you're interested in this program, you can find out more information at gps.ucsd.edu. I'm Jade Guedes, an associate professor, who's jointly appointed between the Department of Anthropology and Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UCSD. So thank you for joining our discussion today. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on our website, china.ucsd.edu. So you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to the panelists, and I'll be reading the questions you submit for our speakers during the Q&A time at the end of your presentation. And so today we're delighted to have Professor Michael Davidson and Professor Peng with us. And I'll give you a little brief introduction to both of them. So Dr. Michael Davidson holds a joint appointment at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Jacobs School of Engineering at UCSD. He's teaching and research focus on the engineering implications and institutional conflicts inherent in deploying low carbon energy at scale to mitigate environmental harms, specializing in applications to China, India, and the United States. His publications on renewable energy, electric power systems, and the political economy of energy markets and low carbon infrastructure have appeared in various outlets, including Nature, Energy, and Foreign Affairs. Prior to UCSD, Dr. Davidson was a postdoctoral research fellow in the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center, and he has a PhD and SM from MIT and a BS and BA from Case Western Reserve University. And he was previously the U.S. China Climate Policy Coordinator for the environmental nonprofit Natural Resources Defense Council and was a Fulbright Fellow to Tsinghua at Tsinghua University. Dr. Peng is an assistant professor of international affairs and civil and environmental engineering at the School of International Affairs, first joint appointment faculty with the School of Engineering at Penn State University. Peng's research focuses on the environmental and socioeconomic impacts of energy policies in both emerging markets and advanced economies. Prior to her arrival at SIA, Peng was a Giorgio Ruffalo postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and her research has been published in PNAS, Nature, Energy, Nature, Sustainability, among others. She earned her PhD from Princeton University and her BS degree from Peking University. So after both the speakers give their brief presentations, I will start a conversation and then we will open it up for Q&A. So welcome.
Excellent. Thank you, Jade, and thanks everyone for joining today. This is it's really great to be joined by my colleague and friend Wei here to talk about this book that we've recently published. Of course, we cannot take credit for the entire book. This was a multi-year effort at the Harvard Kennedy School where both Wei and I were postdoctoral fellows. So this is together with Henry Lee, Dan Schrag, Matt Ba, and Wang Pu, and Mao Jiming. And it is, so we're going to do our best to walk through some of the key elements of this analysis, but we definitely recommend you to read the book to get all of the insights that we have here. So, I'm going to talk briefly about the coal sector and the power sector, electricity markets in particular, and what these mean for how China needs to reform its energy system to be on track for carbon neutrality. So China recently announced that by 2060, it wants to achieve net carbon neutrality. Now, that may seem far away, but in fact, what we point out in this book is that there's a number of steps that need to be taken now in order to make sure that the technologies and institutions are set up to deploy those technologies in an efficient way. And in particular, there's an ongoing debate about the next decade of China's emissions and whether or not there's going to be continued BAU until 2030 when China's committed to peak emissions and then rapidly decline afterwards, or as others, including myself, would argue China should more rapidly bend the curve before 2030 and put in place some measures in order to ensure that we have sustainable long-term reductions in the coal sector. So to just put this in context, coal is of course enormous. Coal accounts for 80% of China's energy-related and process-related CO2 emissions, 80%, it's huge, so it's central to the low-carbon transition. It's around 55% of primary energy consumption, and China has the largest coal fleet in the world at over 1,100 gigawatts. And if you just look back the last 2 decades, China's economic growth was really built on massive increases in coal energy. So it really cannot separate the economic growth and boom that China's faced with its increasing reliance on coal. And as a result of that, many institutions as well as employment have become very dependent and supportive of coal energy. So if you go back to 2013, over 5 million people were employed in the coal mining sector. Actually, if you go back to the 1990s, over 6 million prior to the SOE, state-owned enterprise contraction. But more recently, 2013 was the peak, a little over 5 million. And then just a few years ago, this had shrunk to less than around 3 million. That's still an enormous number. By contrast, the US has less than 40,000 coal miners. So we're talking about a huge number of workers that could potentially be displaced with a rapid contraction in coal. Another aspect of coal is that China has increasingly deployed a number of policies to increase efficiency of coal use. This has been a key feature ever since the early 2000s, when following China's WTO accession, energy growth started to rise really rapidly. And China was quite worried that they were going to face energy shortages. And there were some localized energy shortages at the time. And so it started putting in place a lot of energy intensity policies. But importantly, these were mostly just shifting from low efficiency coal processes to high efficiency coal processes. So not a dramatic shift in terms of what fuel is being used, but just a reduction and a more efficient use of the fuel. So this helps with some overcapacity issues and energy security, but importantly, it does have the potential to create a carbon lock-in in the long term. And that's a key thing that we've identified here, is that some of those policies that may work for short-term priorities don't necessarily line up with carbon neutrality goals. Another key feature of the coal sector in China is that there is a really obvious mismatch between the liberalization in the coal sector, the coal mining and production, and in the electricity sector, a main user of coal. And we saw this most recently in last year's power shortages, where many provinces in China started to face blackouts, brownouts, or targeted power reductions, largely due to the fact that coal prices rose and electricity prices were somewhat capped. And if coal power producers can't pass through the cost of their increased fuel, then they're going to reduce output. This, of course, now presents a more existential crisis than even the climate crisis, because now you're talking about energy security, power security. And as a result of that, we started to actually see some renewed interest in electricity market reforms following the power shortage, which I'll talk about in just a second. Another key feature of the coal sector is local governments. So coal mining is not distributed evenly over the country. About 4 provinces account for over half of the employment. So we're talking about Shanxi, Henan, Shandong, Inner Mongolia. So if you're thinking about who's going to be hurt by, who's going to feel the pain as a result of transitioning towards low carbon, that's not evenly distributed. Those local governments are going to be more apt to be supportive of the existing coal institutions, existing coal firms, and going to create problems for national strategies. And another key part of this is that, we talk about employment. Actually, the labor intensity of China's coal mining sector is enormously varied by over an order of magnitude, depending on how mechanized and how easy the coal is to access. So if you go to Inner Mongolia, it's about an order of magnitude more labor efficient than some other eastern provinces like Henan. So that has huge implications for how you need to transition away from coal. And the last thing about power plants, before I talk about kind of the power sector, is coal power plants were designed to operate in a base load fashion. They were designed to operate at a continuous level for a long period of time. And as a result, their revenue structures and markets were really only designed to provide a stable source of revenue at a fixed price. And average energy pricing is not good when you have more renewables coming on the grid, because you want to create more price signals and you want to encourage more flexibility to respond to the variability in solar and wind output. And so China's electricity system and markets are not very well suited for these new tasks before it. So what I argue in my chapter on coal is that we need to think about moving coal from a barrier to a bridge on the low carbon transition pathway for China. So one is, as coal moves from baseload to more flexible operation, it needs to find new energy, new streams of revenue besides just the old average energy only pricing. And the hybrid plan market that's existing now is not well suited to that. Needs to move to more valuing more real-time energy prices, as well as ancillary services and capacity payments and others. The second big challenge that China is going to face on its coal sector is thinking about district heating. So a large number of cities in the northern part of China are reliant on coal to provide not only power, but also heat. And they've invested an enormous amount of heating grids to pipe that heat into homes and businesses. That's a huge sunk investment. Now, you could either abandon that and move to having everybody have heat pumps in their houses, or you could think about adapting that grid, the heating grid, to accommodate new sources of energy, whether it's captured coal-powered CHP, combined heat and power, or some other source of energy. And then the third big issue, which is potentially even more challenging than power, is industry. Half of China's coal is not used in power sector, it's used in other sectors. And those are processes that's even more costly to substitute. We're talking about natural gas, potentially in a short run, unlikely, but maybe even hydrogen or massive electrification down the road. And those are much further, much more costly, and we don't necessarily have all the technologies available to do that. So just shifting gears just a little bit, talk about the electricity sector and what we identify as some key barriers. The first is, as I mentioned, this energy-only pricing system where plants are paid the same tariff regardless of how much they're paying and how much they are when they're generating. That can create these very perverse incentives for overcapacity build-outs, and it basically results in particular local governments very eager to over-permit coal plants and respond to in response to those incentive structures that then creates this resulting falling of capacity factors in the coal sector. And if China needs to, for China to address that, it needs to move to a more marginal least cost dispatch-based system. Now, China has initiated an electricity market reform going on 6 years now. This has actually resulted in quite a bit of change in the structure of the electricity market. So we started from less than a few percent of electricity being sold through markets prior to 2015 to nowadays closer to 40% of electricity is now sold through market-based transactions, whether bilateral contracts or exchanges or things like that. So that's an enormous shift, right? That reflects the fact that there is actually a lot of movement here. But importantly, this was initiated by the center, but it really is provinces that are leading the way on marketizing electricity sector. And what that means is that every province is kind of designing their own market. And they design it in such a way to benefit, their particular interests and local interest groups and their favorite industries. And they also put up barriers, protectionist barriers for trading between provinces. That has huge implications because we know that China is going to have to rely on large-scale interregional transmission, of which it already has the largest high voltage grid in the world, but it needs to be operated much more efficiently, effectively to manage the supply, the variable supply of wind and solar. And we just saw some recent guidance where unified national electricity market is starting to gain a little more traction. This was even discussed at a very high level leading committee chaired by Xi Jinping last fall after the power shortage. So there's some indication that maybe we are seeing a little bit more steps towards this. But importantly, the most recent one still indicated and highlighted that provinces are the center of this new market, even if it is a unified national system. And that is probably going to have to erode or change over time in order to create more effective balancing of renewables. And then I'll just close with just one final point, because I'm sure many folks have heard China has put in place the largest carbon market in the world, right? That's quite exciting. Now, what you'll probably may not know is that, in fact, it's not a cap and trade system, unlike what you have in the EU or you have California or other places, but it's in fact a performance benchmark system. And the choice of the design of this was dictated precisely because the electricity market is not liberalized fully. And the implications of this performance benchmark system is that it's an intensity-based system that basically scales with how much production you have. So if you produce more, you get more permits. And the ratio of that is based on whatever benchmark category you are in. So as a result of that, high efficiency coal plants actually get more permits than they use. So what we call an implicit output subsidy. That degrades the efficiency of this ETS, and over time is going to make it less effective tool. Actually, it's not very effective currently, but it's going to limit the effectiveness of this tool until such time you have much more effective electricity market price signal pass through. And importantly, it doesn't provide any fuel switching to move from coal to lower carbon fuels like renewables, which we'll get to now with Wei. So I'll stop there and hand it over to my co-author Wei.
Thank you, Michael. Being on the same panel with Michael reminds me of the old good days when we were both postdoc and working on this book. Oh, maybe you can see it. Oh, virtual background. But so I want to start by reminding all of us what Michael mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, which is what is the overarching question for this book, or overarching theme for this book? To me, the theme is really about how can we better connect the near-term action with China's long-term ambitious goal of achieving net zero. And I think this is particularly important for China because if you think about how the carbon emissions has changed or evolved over time in the past 40 years, the trajectory for China in the past 40 years would pretty much look like this. This was the emissions back in the 1980s, and this is where we are today. There were some fluctuations, but really it's the increasing trend. And then thinking about what China wants to achieve in the next 40 years, they want to achieve net zero by 2060, meaning that the emission trajectory will need to be like this in the next 40 years. So the country aims to completely reverse its emission trajectory in the next 40 years. It also means that thinking about the transformation in the energy system China has experienced in the past 40 years, what we are going to see in the next 40 years will be no less dramatic than what has happened in the past 40 years. So I think having that big picture in mind, it makes it particularly important for us to think about this connection between near-term efforts and the long-term goal. And I think when we think about this question, there are two approaches we can potentially take. One is to say that, hey, we're here today, so let's start with where we are today and then adjust our next action so that we're going to moving closer to that long-term goal of reaching net zero. But we can also take another approach, which is thinking about what we want to be 40 years from now, which is really a net zero energy system for the whole economy. And we can only imagine how that system will look like, and then work our way backward to think about what are the near-term decisions will really help us get there. In reality, our approach is more like in between. It is going to be a hybrid approach of the two approaches I described just now, so that we can also ensure near-term feasibility and at the same time deliver that long-term ambition. So with that overarching theme in mind, I'm going to talk about two chapters that I was involved in this book. One is about renewable energy development. I'll talk less about this because a lot of the core elements are also relevant to what Michael already talked about the electricity market, about the coal-heavy grid China has today. I will also talk about the second topic, which is air pollution. And I will also talk about why air pollution should be part of the discussion at all, given that this is a talk about energy. So let's start with the first one, which is renewable. So if we think about where we are China today, we're talking about roughly 10% wind and solar power in the electricity mix. Then what China would be like in 2060? It's hard to say. If we have a net zero economy by 2060, it likely means that we're going to have net zero electricity system earlier than that. Then how much wind and solar we need in that net zero electricity system, I don't even want to get into that debate because it has a lot to do with what is your assumption about nuclear, about your energy efficiency, future electricity demand, and also do we have large scale battery available by then? But that's going to be a much larger penetration level than today. That is something we know for sure. So if we start with 10% renewable penetration today and thinking about how can we get to 12%, I may give you different suggestions if we're thinking about really ultimately we want to get to 50% or more 40 years from now. So it is that question that motivated to us to think about what are the near-term strategies China should be thinking about. We talk more in the book, but I just want to mention too that I think are some of the core issues to think about. One is the siting decisions in terms of where you want to invest your new wind and solar power plants. So traditionally, it is very natural that investors are going to put wind and solar in the places where we have best wind and solar resources. It's just cheaper to do that. And also, there are usually large-scale transmission being applied along with those large wind and solar farms. But in the future, if we're really thinking about 50% or more renewable penetration, it means that it's going to be everywhere in the country. It's not going to be only those like wind and solar abundant regions in the northern part and western part of China. It's really going to be everywhere throughout the country. So there's value to think about how can we kind of like accelerate the deployment in those regions that have less resources at the face value, but at the same time, letting them experiment and also build the market and also the government structure today so that in the future, they can do better in integrating wind and solar locally as well. The second element or second issue to consider about renewable is about the new frontiers for innovation. So of course, it is always important to make wind and solar cheaper over time. But if we're really thinking about larger scale renewable integration in the future, then thinking about large scale storage is definitely a priority for us when identifying where will be the next area for where innovation efforts is most needed. And at the same time, for example, China also have the scale effort of large scale efforts to scale up electric vehicles, how those new demand from new sectors are going to make electricity sector and renewable integration more challenging with some new opportunities will be also the new areas where requires more innovation efforts as well. So that's my first topic about renewable development. Then I want to move on to the second topic, which is about air pollution. So the first question is why air pollution is even part of this book, because this book is about a low carbon energy system. And the main reason is that the urgency of air pollution concern could drive the near-term efforts to shift away from coal, because coal emits both CO2 and air pollution. So shifting away from coal is actually beneficial for both mitigating carbon emissions and also air pollution. And I actually think that I used the word could drive the near-term efforts. That was too weak, because I should say it has been the driver in the past decade or so. So if you ask me, what are the main driver for the low carbon energy transition that has happened in China in the past 10 years, I'm going to say like air pollution on the one hand, making shifting away from coal really urgent, and the other is really the drop in cost for renewables, thanks partly to the industrial policy efforts by China. But then the question is, okay, if air pollution is like the efforts to tackle near-term air pollution and this political salience is helping us so much, then should we be worried anything in the long run? I do think there are things to be worried when connecting this near-term priority and the long-term efforts. The main reason is that as we shift away from coal, we're going to clean up the air. That's mainly because fossil fuel combustion is a major driver for air pollution. And if we're thinking about by 2060, it's net zero, but the majority of the air pollution problem is going to be gone by then. But of course, around that time, we need to think about new air pollution sources, for example, from food production, and then maybe like even from biocrop production. And also people would argue that there's no safe limit below which air pollution is not going to harm your health. So of course, the battle to tackle air pollution, it will exist in 2050 or even beyond. But my point is, this opportunity to co-control air pollution and CO2 will gradually diminish over time. And more importantly, as we squeeze coal more and more out of the energy system, the marginal cost to squeeze more coal out of the system is going to become more expensive. So if you're thinking about 10 years ago, back in, for example, 2013, also when China started this war against air pollution, they were still relatively less efficient coal power plants, and also a lot of power plants doesn't have really perfect end-of-pipe controls. So there were still low-hanging fruits back then that can clean up the air and at the same time mitigate carbon emissions. Those low-cost options are gone. If you're thinking about further reducing air pollution from China's energy system, now is the time for us to thinking about really shifting away from like a lot of like fossil intensive technologies and making that energy transition as the next approach to get to cleaner air. Then the last point I want to make here is that, okay, now that we know that air pollution is a near-term concern and we have a net zero goal by 2060, how can I connect the dots? I think the way to think about the policy window, the way to think about this air pollution issue is to think of it as a policy window, where because of this push to clean up the air, if we can use this policy window strategically to deploy those technologies and those investments that are also beneficial for the long run decarbonization efforts, that's going to be a great opportunity. And renewable penetration or integration, as we described earlier, or shifting away from coal are definitely among those lists where you can see cleaning up the air, providing additional motivation so that we're going to go towards the right direction in order to achieve deep decarbonization. So with that, I'm going to end here and very much look forward to the questions and more discussions.
Thank you so much, Wei and Michael. So we do have some questions that can get the discussion started. I would just like to remind the audience, you can go ahead and submit your questions in the Q&A box, and then I'll read them out. So one question is, what policies do you think are least aligned with long-term decarbonization, even if they might have some short-term carbon benefits? And
I could take a crack at this one, but Wade, feel free to jump in. I would probably say that there are these capacity reduction policies that are in place, which really focus on shutting down small coal plants, small steel plants, small cement kilns, and replacing them with larger steel plants, larger cement kilns, larger power plants. They're more efficient, but now you have these long-lived assets that are going to be around for another 40 years. So you get some short-term benefits. And if you look at Chinese, their stated national climate strategies and plans that they submit to the UN, they claim that these policies have been their primary climate change action up until Paris. They get the largest number of megatons reduced per year out of these policies, but they don't have a place in a long-term decarbonization plan. That's my thought.
Yeah, I can add one more example from the air pollution perspective. I think this is less discussed these days, but it was a really hot topic about 5 years ago, which is synthetic natural gas, converting coal into gas. And because burning gas is cleaner compared with coal, this is a great strategy to mitigate air pollution from the coal system. But this is a terrible idea for carbon emissions, because as you convert energy multiple times from coal to natural gas and then burn gas for something else, you actually lower the overall energy efficiency, end up with higher life cycle carbon emissions. And this is also not to mention, there's like water stress issues, sometimes even water quality issues that's going to intensify because of synthetic natural gas. But I think this is a good example to say that, there are strategies if air pollution is your only near-term goal, and by ignoring the long-term decarbonization strategy, you may end up in some unintended consequences in the long run.
Great, thank you. So are there any, another question is, are there any air pollution, this is a question for Wei, are there any air pollution policies that have made climate change efforts harder in China?
Yeah, I think the synthetic natural gas example was a very valid one. And on top of that, we can largely clean up the air without changing the way we use energy. And I think United States is a great example. Now we have scrubbers, we have the power plants, and we also have like emission standards for vehicles. So today, even though we still have like air pollution, especially in where I am, like Pennsylvania, We still have one of the highest pollution level across the country, but it's much, much better back comparing with the 70s and 60s. So it's the same logic as applied to China. So China can largely clean up the air pollution from the coal fleets by, first of all, using more advanced coal technologies, such as ultra supercritical coal, because of that is going to give you higher plant efficiency, sometimes close to natural gas plant. And on top of that, if you install SO2 and also NOx and also PM anode pipe controls, basically you can largely remove the majority of the air pollution. There's a small carbon penalty there because operating those anode pipe control, you're going to, you need additional energy. So you actually lower the plant efficiency by a tiny bit, but I usually think that is small enough to be ignored given the primary goal is to clean up the air pollution. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that synthetic natural gas, just as an example, is a situation where there's a clear trade-off between air pollution mitigation and carbon mitigation. But the other example I was giving just now, which is installing anode pipe control, China should do it just like other countries. But this is an example where it's great to clean up the air and you can get a lot by doing that, but it doesn't really help you get your long-term decarbonization goal.
Thank you. I just had a follow-up question. Is the resistance to install those largely from private enterprise and business because it's costly?
I don't think there's a strong, well, so first of all, if you don't have a regulation, there's always a resistance, right? Because this is additional cost. But I think that resistance has gradually gone away to a large extent in China because since 2013, there has been tons of new policies to make sure that the air pollution is going to improve over time. And especially because for the power plants, we do have anode pipe controls. This is a much easier sector to clean up the air pollutant emissions comparing with, for example, clean up residential coal use, like emissions from there. So we actually see a lot of success in actually really increasing the installation rate of anode pipe controls on power plants. I really think from the air pollution perspective, the next big thing is to thinking about the residential emissions, because that's hard. And there's still a lot of rural areas where you don't have good incentives to clean up. They're still using, some of them still using coal. There's some really least developed regions still using biomass, and that's really polluted and has health damages. I see residential sector as the much more difficult sector comparing with power.
I might jump in there too, because one aspect that I see in the power sector is that with all the retrofits that Wei talked about, so increasing end of pipe controls as well as going to higher efficiencies, generally speaking, this requires you to operate your plant at a higher output in order to make them very effective. So an ultra supercritical plant that's operating at 50% output is no longer ultra supercritical because it doesn't get the temperatures and pressures necessary to get that high efficiency burn. So as a result of that, you actually see this ironic that when you have these ULE plants, the ultra low emission plants, they become less flexible on the system, so less adapted to responding to renewable energy variability. And there's a clear trade-off because on one hand, everything should be ultra low emission, but also there should also be lots of flexibility retrofits. And there is sort of this interesting trade-off because if you're operating at really low outputs, you might get some increase in NOx emissions because the temperatures are lower. Starting up and down generators causes additional emissions. So there's some interesting trade-offs right now in the system, and I don't quite think the power sector planners have figured out what's the best way to solve this conflict in the next next few decades.
Thank you. That's fascinating. So we have another question from the audience from David Edick, who asks, I will just go ahead and press answer live. He asks, basically, with provinces apparently designing their own electricity pricing regimes, who's managing the national grid, and isn't there a chance of undermining grid reliability?
That's a good question. China's electricity market systems actually are really designed for reliability. And so China historically has had very high reliability. Last fall really was an aberration in a lot of contexts. I faced more power outages in California than I did when I was living in Beijing. But the markets need to become more flexible in order to accommodate more low carbon power sources. So you're not necessarily sacrificing grid reliability by, and in fact, you could enhance grid reliability to some extent by integrating provinces more flexibly on a more short-term basis. But the real gains that you're going to get are from integrating more renewables and reducing the amount of curtailment or wasted renewables that you might have if you want to tap renewable energy sources that are really far away.
Thank you. So we have another question from Victor, and his question is, he says, is reducing polluting industries like steel and cement a part of reduction of air pollution, and has that run its course, and can China deindustrialize more? And I'm guessing that's primarily for Wei.
Yeah, so great question. First of all, industry is definitely important for air pollution reduction as well. And I think there are certain industries such as steel and cement, because there are mainly large point sources, some of the annual pipe controls could still work. But what I find really challenging, especially because I work on air pollution modeling, so I deal with emission inventory, like these are the how much emissions from power sector, residential sector, industry sector, et cetera, et cetera. Industry sector is interesting in the sense that it's difficult to get, it is so diverse, and different industrial processes are going to have different emission factors for SO2 and NOx, and they also have different potential to get reduced over time. So I think steel and cement are the sectors indeed people talk most about because they're big. And also there are, these are a few, or maybe more than a few, but 10 or 20 major companies you should target in order to reduce the air pollution. But at the same time, there is also a wide range of much smaller industries that from my perspective are so diverse, diverse not only in the terms of technology and processes, diverse also in terms of the organized interest. Like they're really disorganized to some extent. So I think from that perspective, I see a lot of challenges in the industrial sectors to decarbonize and also to reduce air pollutant emission from their processes. Not a very satisfying answer, but I guess this is me sharing the challenges I see from the industry sector.
So somewhat related question is from Jay Wilson. So he asks, how soon do you see advanced nuclear replacing coal when it comes to electricity production and as an industrial heat source?
I can take a stab at this. I mean, China is, of course, building, has the largest nuclear growth rate in the world, but it's still much slower than what their plans were because they're facing issues to ensure safety, particularly in response to Fukushima. They have been devoting a lot of money to develop domestic indigenous designs for Gen 2, Gen 3 reactors. These are still conventional fission reactors, large scale, but safer design, newer ones, designs. I suspect that those are going to be the majority of what nuclear China plans to deploy. And kind of our rough estimates just based on siting. China has historically not wanted to site any nuclear plants inland, primarily because of the risk of flooding nearby large rivers and other concerns. And so if you just look at siting and the size of the plants and proximity to populations, et cetera, you're looking at maybe 200, 250 gigawatts of nuclear potential around out to mid-century. I think most models just kind of bake that in because we expect just kind of ignoring the cost perspective because they've just spent a lot of money to develop these technologies and now exporting it. I think that those are going to deploy. I think the advanced ones are just highly more speculative. So you could talk about advanced large-scale reactors, which are highly untested and have had all sorts of problems, or you could talk about small modular reactors, which is not really China's strength, right? To do something small and modular, it's usually do something big and efficient. And so I think those are much more speculative, but I'm much more confident that China is going to go ahead with its large-scale fission reactor build out. Yeah.
Thank you. So Norman Waite asks, he's got two questions on the carbon market. And he asks, so while current pricing is not going to be a factor in fuel switching, as you say, Michael, won't the data be critical in top level design issues like cadre assessments, dual control, etc.? And then the second part of that question is if China wants to shift from a cap and trade from its current capacity model, how difficult would that be?
Hi, Norm. Yeah, thanks for the easy questions. So first off, the prices, I don't even really care about the prices because the prices don't reflect really any fundamental economic signal, right? And so the first thing you should do when you look at like a Chinese carbon price, like graph, and then the EU graph, the first thing you do is just throw it away because it doesn't matter. Because this is a performance benchmark trading system, the marginal cost that's faced by an emitting firm is not the value of that permit because it's in relation to what their emissions outputs are in reference to the benchmark standard. And so some firms could actually receive a negative carbon pricing signal, which of course would not happen in any cap and trade system. So I don't really care too much about the prices, but yeah, I understand why people look at the prices. That's important. I think that, if we wanted to look at put in place a cap and trade system, the first thing you have to do, obviously you have to put in place a cap, which China has not done yet. But the first thing you need to do is you need to have very effective fuel price pass-through. And electricity markets are not flexible enough yet to make that happen. We have seen some movement on that, particularly after the power shortage last year, where we saw some kind of increase in the allowable electricity prices. So, there exist markets, but they're kind of up to a cap. They raise the cap. So if they raise the cap even more and the coal price and electricity price can kind of pass through on that, then you can pass through also the permits, sure. But we have also seen some worrying kind of deliberalization trends where now they're thinking, well, okay, maybe we don't like this coal price fluctuation too much, which caused energy shortage. So maybe we actually want to go back to more of a plan-based coal pricing system. And that would be going in the exact opposite direction that they need to do in order to make ETS effective. So we're still waiting to see kind of the relative strengths of these two policy proposals.
Can I quickly add to that? I'm not an expert on this, but I'm never a big fan of carbon market in general. And I guess this, it's not because it's not a good thing, but it's because empirically there has been a lot of evidence showing us this like upsetting results that really carbon market is not really reducing near-term emissions and they're not also inducing innovation. So, why should we pay so much attention on this? But I do remember that when we were writing this book together, there's one argument that made me think carbon pricing is going to be important, especially in the China context, which I remember vividly, like even 3 years after. And that point is for China, just as Michael mentioned, the price level might not be important, but it is important to build out this infrastructure, especially a market-based infrastructure, so that we can improve. First of all, we can collect better data, understanding how much emissions are actually coming from the major sources, and also building this capacity over time for market-oriented practices in general. So I think that's kind of like the argument that made me realize that yes, there is, even though it may not reduce that much emissions, the price level may be low. Like it might not induce fuel switching or even long-term innovation, but I still think there is a value to have it in place today.
Thank you. So the next two questions are sort of related. David Leah asks, he says, you mentioned that energy security will always take precedence over climate mitigation in China and perhaps everywhere around the world. And if so, what ensures that mitigation will continue to be a priority given the vagaries of geopolitical tensions and energy pricing?
I think this is an important question. I think first thing that we need to recognize, which the head of IEA, Fatih Birol, also recognized, and many others, is that the power crisis that started last year and has continued through the winter was a fossil fuel market crisis, right? It was caused by volatility in natural gas prices and volatility in coal prices. That was not caused by low carbon policies or low carbon renewable energy variability or those kinds of things. Now, there may be some localized cases in case someone wants to shout at me in the comments, but on a global scale, that was not the issue. So the takeaway from me is that hey, wind and solar would not have that huge volatility and that kind of risk associated with it. If Guangdong, which has almost no solar power currently and reliant on coal and saw huge coal price spikes that cause power shortages and issues with manufacturing and all that, if they had 10-20% share of solar and wind on, like they're planning to build going forward, that price spike would have been lessened. So I think there's a lot of synergies here between energy security goals and climate change goals. But whenever they diverge, you can bet China and every other country is not going to shut out the lights to cut down carbon, right? So you have to think very strategically about that. And I think right now in China, there's a lot of discussion around how do you get the capacity and reliability incentives right in the system. And that's kind of embedded in a whole mess of other bureaucratic issues of who has control over determining what plants get built, how do you value different renewable energy sources versus fossil sources. All of those things are at play there. But you can bet that energy security is always going to be the first priority when you're thinking about redesigning power systems.
Right, and then as a sort of follow-up to that, an anonymous attendee, pointed out that China is the largest supplier of solar panels. So is solar energy going to be the biggest part, the biggest part of China's energy transition, and how will that sort of fit in with the global market?
I could take a brief stab at that. I think. We didn't talk about the other geopolitical tensions associated with China's solar market, but we've done some long-term modeling studies that show that in order to reach carbon neutrality, China's going to have to build a lot of solar and wind, and also quite a bit of other low-carbon firm sources like nuclear, more hydro, and probably some carbon capture on the coal plants and gas plants. So you're going to need a little bit of, a bit of everything. The solar is going to have enormous growth, right? Some of the numbers coming out of our study now are on the order of 3,000 to 4,000 gigawatts or more of solar needs to be built by 2060. That's up from around 300 gigawatts today. That would be an enormous, order 2 to 3 times increase annually. Going out for 40 years. That's an enormous implication on manufacturing, supply chains, development, and all of those. So it's not easy and baked in by any sense.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think if we are trying to tie these two questions together, geopolitics and low carbon energy technologies, yes, recently there have been a lot of discussions about because of this geopolitical issue like onshoring mandates, et cetera, are we going to see this resilience, are we going to see supply chain shocks that are going to affect our ability to transition to deploy and invest in low carbon energy transition? And is it going to make decarbonization more costly overall? Because we cannot deploy wind and solar everywhere we want, and it's not going to be that easy to buy down the cost given the global market we used to have in the past. I think here is where I think short-term and long-term perspective probably would differ. If you're asking me about what do I worry about in the next 5 years, yes, I do, especially as a Chinese living in the United States. But if you ask me, do I worry about this around the time horizon of net zero, like 2050, I probably wouldn't worry that much. Because it's all about incentives. Once you have the right incentive, the firms are going to innovate and also find the potential alternatives. And I think having those innovation into perspective and knowing that we have 40 years ahead of us, I think some of the supply chain issues might gradually go away. I know some of you probably would say I'm optimistic, but I guess to some extent, I also hope I am right in this regard, because this is going to be a good news for the global decarbonization.
Great. So sort of slightly related is, are there studies on whether the massive buildup of mass transportation like HSR and high-speed rail and subway systems have helped reduce carbon emissions? And I'd sort of add, particularly thinking per capita, when we think about, China's relatively low per use capita compared to a country that's heavily car reliant like the United States. And how much of a reduction do we expect there to be, or do we still expect there to be an increase?
Yeah, I do think there's one recent paper that is on that topic, and I think overall they did find that having this high speed rail can indeed reduce carbon emissions, because now people can use this mass transport as a way to lower their carbon footprint. But when I was reading that paper, I think one question I had was also about these macroeconomic effects that was not particularly being considered in that analysis. So if you have a more integrated transportation system in general, like making this easier for everyone, are we going to see more fundamental changes in terms of sectors, in terms of this trade linkages within the country? And is it I think it is, it's going to be a good thing to booster like new industries and also new opportunities. And what will be the overall general equilibrium effects on the economic growth and carbon emissions? I don't think those kind of things are being considered in that particular analysis, but would be an interesting paper to write, I guess, if we have the right tool and right data.
On sort of a related note, I actually have a question. So, in the United States, like a good portion of our carbon emissions come from domestic short-haul flights, right? And with the establishment of these high-speed rails, if you're thinking about this on a per capita basis, how, do you think that China is investing a lot more in domestic flights or even long-haul flights, and will that sort of tip the carbon budget, or do you think there's enough investment in high-speed rail and other things that would help offset the, the sort of growing demand for air travel somewhat?
Great question. This is not my direct area of expertise, so I'm going to answer the question just like someone growing up in China and having chat with my mom every evening about her experience. I think high-speed rails really transformed the way Chinese travel. Definitely my family for sure. And I think a lot of people prefer taking a long speed train rather than if it's 2 to 3 hour flight for many different reasons. There are convenience reasons. It actually takes a long time to commute to airport. And also there's cancellation happening all the time. This is again personal experience. So I think there's a convenience reason, and also there's price concerns. You can get the same price for the train ticket next day, but it won't be the case for air travel. So I actually think that this is me just as an observer. I actually think that the high-speed train can replace a lot of, for example, 3 hour or shorter type of flight in China. Even though I think a lot of the cities in China, including my hometown Changsha in southern China, they largely already built the airport 10 years ago also. So they have the capacity. It's just there's no additional need, or a smaller amount of additional need now comparing with before, to expand the terminals, or to expand the capacity of the airports.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. I know I am eagerly awaiting the opening of the Chengdu-Lanzhou Tielu myself. I'll sort of shift to another question about new forms of energy. So Joseph Jacobelli asks, he says, thank you for your excellent insights, Dr. Davidson and Peng. And he says, could you please talk about your assessment on the future role and growth of new energy vehicles in China's NZE plan? And then I guess I'll just read the second part of the question. Is, do you have any thoughts on the participation of foreign enterprises in China's deregulating energy markets, such as carbon trading or electricity trading?
I guess I'd take a step. China, of course, as we know, has the largest EV market, and it's growing. And last year was a banner year, right? And there are a lot of reasons. China's been, of course, subsidizing EVs, but those subsidies have been shrinking. But there are other reasons, particularly local regulations around car ownership, and then other advantages that have been pushing more EVs into the market. And I think this is a great sign. I think it's critical because we do know that electrification is really central to every decarbonization strategy, because it's much easier to create low carbon electricity sources than it is to substitute away all these other fuels, whether it's aviation or it's fuel in your car, or industry processes. So to the extent that we can electrify cost effectively, we should be. And electric vehicles are a way to do that. And there's also some interesting industrial structure advantages to China to electrify, in the sense that we have all these batteries floating around and you have a really large grid company that's managing it, that can actually provide a lot of grid services in a way that we can't, it's much harder to monetize in the US. And I think that's, and State Grid already has the largest kind of centralized EV charge controller monitoring station. I think there's a lot of benefits that the grid company could see in doing this. And I guess relatedly to the second question, yeah, for consulting services, you can send me an email if you want to start a company in China, not my expertise. I think that the private sector participation in power generation, particularly from foreign enterprises, is probably going to be limited because the competition is just so fierce in China. On the other hand, in these other like EVs, right? Tesla has a huge potential market in China, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty as to where new battery technologies are going to be developed, and you can have lots of integrated supply chains. So I think there's some interesting opportunities.
So we still have a lot of questions, but I'm going to attempt to meld two of them together. So Rocco Cartucelli, I guess, and Qian Luo are basically asking about social justice and displacement of workers, and what steps they're asking is the Chinese government taking to ease the transition away in coal and, essentially ensure a just energy transition. And I'd sort of add to that, there's also the issue of people being displaced through, construction of new solar or water power or nuclear technology. So what's going on that front?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I know Wei has thoughts on this too. China has a lot of state-owned enterprises in the coal sector, and this can actually help with the low carbon transition, because these state-owned enterprises, they have a kind of an implicit social obligation to take care of workers. They have a little bit deeper budget pockets, and they're also more incentivized to diversify than some other companies. Right. So, because you could still find coal utilities here in the US and Europe that all they do is coal. They have very little interest in doing renewables. So they're only going to lose by a transition. But that's not the case. All of the major SOE power companies in China are heavily diversified, and they're being forced to become even more diversified because they're state-owned and because of the central commitment to carbon neutrality. That provides a lot of opportunities for worker transition. There are central funds that will pay companies and also local governments, a little bit of money for workers that are displaced because of closing down coal mining, steel, cement. I think there probably need to be, orders of magnitude larger to actually address the problem that's inherent in there. But up until now, I think the large state-owned enterprise have mostly managed them on their books. It's really the private, those mines that are really labor intense, that are not owned by the big SOEs, that have been shedding a lot of workers and where you see less protection.
Yeah, just to add very quickly on that, I definitely think SOE is one important angle to look at this just transition issues. And the other angle is really about this unequal impacts across different provinces. So if you're thinking about some provinces that they may even benefit from this low carbon transition, but challenges are really real for those coal-intensive provinces Michael was mentioning in his remark earlier. I do think that for those provinces, it will be really hard to completely depend on what the central could offer. So I think that there's no, I'm not smart enough to provide a silver bullet strategy there, but I do think that recognizing those challenges are real, and there are provinces that suffer much more than the rest of the country, is at least an important starting point to think about this transitional issues.
Thank you. So there are many more great questions that have been asked that I know you have not been able to answer, and I know we're almost at time, so I have to unfortunately tie this up. But I wanted to thank everybody for being here today. This webinar will be available in the next few days on our website, which is china.ucsd.edu. china.ucsd.edu, and please join us again for our upcoming webinars, which are the growing role of science, technology, and higher education in China's Belt and Road Initiative by Dennis Simon at Duke University. And that'll be on February 24th. On March 17th, we will have a talk by Dimitar from Syracuse, Georgia from Syracuse University, retrofitting Leninism, participation without democracy in modern China. And then on March 24th, we will have a talk by Ling Chen, which is a counterproductive tech war, why state-business relations matter in China and in the US. So thank you to the audience for the very lively discussion and for all of your questions. I will see you all next time. Thank you. And thank you to the speakers for the lovely talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Michael and Wei.
Thanks.
I will send you all the questions.
Yeah, there's so many great ones. I
copied paste all the questions, so
yeah.
Is that my homework for tonight?
no need to worry about it. I will send you tonight. And also I will send a thank you note to all the registrants, which is 104, and with the link to your book.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was fascinating. Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.